Article 1, Section 8. Federalism and the overall scope of federal power. Common interpretation by Randy E. Burnett and Heather Jerkin. In practice, federalism has waxed and waned since the founding, and the federal-state relations have always been contested. Nonetheless, federalism underwent 4 distinct phases during our 4 different eras in our constitutional history: post-founding, post-Civil War, post-New Deal, and from the Rehnquist Court to today. Enumerated powers federalism. In 1787, the Constitution replaced the Articles of Confederation, which was essentially a treaty among sovereign states, with the new constitution ratified by the people themselves in state conventions rather than by state legislatures. The founders provided the national government with the powers elect under the Articles and ensured it would be able to act on behalf of the citizenry directly without going through the state governments. But the founders also thought it important to preserve the state's power over their own citizens. The founders struck this balance by granting the new national government unlimited and enumerated powers and leaving the regulation of interstate commerce to the states. State legislature powers were almost exclusively limited by their own constitutions. Federalism and the founding can therefore best be described as enumerated powers federalism. The national government was conceived as one of limited enumerated powers. The powers of states were simply everything left over after that enumeration. This is expressed in the first words of Article 1, which created Congress. All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in the Congress of the United States. The 10th Amendment reinforces this principle. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. State power, then, was protected not by affirmative shielding state power, but by limiting the ability of the federal government to act in the first place. Fundamental rights federalism. Federalism changed in the wake of the Civil War. The Republican in the 38th Congress enacted the 13th Amendment, eliminating the power of states to enforce slavery within their borders. But the Southern states almost immediately used the rest of their vast police powers to enact black codes to oppress the newly freed slaves. Their aim was to come as closely as possible to restoring slavery in everything but name. In response to this, the Republican in the 39th Congress used their 13th Amendment enforcement power to enact the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Although they overrode the veto of President Johnson by supermajorities in both houses, some in Congress saw the need to write these protections into the Constitution, lest courts question Congress's power to enact the Civil Rights Act. The Republicans thus created the 14th Amendment. Section 1 forbade states from violating the fundamental rights of their own citizens, placing new federal constraints on all 3 branches of state governments. Section 5 granted Congress the power to enforce these constraints. With the passage of the 14th Amendment, the federal government could now prevent states from violating the privileges and immunities of their citizens, depriving anyone of life, liberty, or property without due process, and denying anyone equal protection. Following on its heels, a similar provision was enacted to prevent states from denying citizens the right to vote based on their race. The Reconstruction Amendments, taken together, just ushered in what we can call fundamental rights federalism. Soon after its enactment, however, the Supreme Court systematically neutered the fundamental rights federalism of the Reconstruction Amendments through such cases as the Slanderhorse case, 1873, U.S. v. Cruikshank, 1875, the Civil Rights cases, 1883, Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, and Gills v. Harris, 1903. As a result, the powers accorded to the federal government lay dormant until the court and Congress took them up again in the early 20th century to protect economic liberties in cases like Lochner v. New York, 1905, and Buchanan v. Wally, 1917. Eventually, beginning in the 1930s until today, the court largely withdrew from this era in favor of protecting so-called fundamental rights and the civil rights of suspect classes like racial minorities. New Deal federalism. With the New Deal, the court expanded federal regulatory power, relying primarily on the Commerce Clause and the Necessary and the Proper Clause to expand Congress' reach. The court effectively brought about the demise of the enumerated powers federalism of the founding era. The court interpreted Article 1 to give Congress the power to regulate wholly interstate economic activity that substantially affects interstate commerce. Because the scope and importance of the national economy and vastly outpaces the vision of interstate commerce held by the founders, the power to regulate anything that affects interstate commerce amounts to the power to regulate almost everything. As a result, the federal government could now regulate in areas once governed exclusively by the states. It could even regulate the states themselves. So what becomes of the state in the wake of a New Deal federalism, state sovereignty federalism? Enter the Rehnquist Court. After William Rehnquist became Chief Justice in 1986, the court began developing what came to be known as the New Federalism, which in this story could be called state sovereignty federalism. First came the court's so-called 10th Amendment cases of New York versus United States, 1992, Georgia versus Ashcroft, 1991, and Prince versus United States, 1997. In each of these cases, the court attempted to carve out a zone of state autonomy that the federal government could not invade. States were thus shielded from federal regulation in a fashion that private parties were not. Then came the 11th Amendment cases of Seminole Tribal of Florida versus Florida, 1996, and Alden versus Maine, 1999, immunizing states from some lawsuits in federal court in order to preserve their sovereign standards. The Rehnquist Court later began tentatively to revive enumerated powers federalism in cases like United States versus Lopez, 1995, and United States versus Morrison, 2000. Pushing back against New Deal federalism, the court continued to license federal regulation for wholly interstate economic activity that had a substantial effect on interstate commerce, while joining the line and the regulation of non-economic interstate activity. The Roberts Court has now taken up the mantle like its predecessor. It can continue both to 1. Invoke state sovereignty to preserve the zone of state autonomy, and 2. Build out a modern version of enumerated powers federalism by interpreting the New Deal federalism and the high watermark of federal power such that federal powers cannot be expanded still further without a limiting principle. The first strategy places external limits on Congress power, marking where Congress power ends by identifying where state power begins, use sovereignty as a touchstone. The second derives those limits internally without reference to the states. But both are efforts to cut back on the expansive use of federal power that evolved in the wake of the New Deal and thereby preserve a zone of autonomy for the states. Matter of Debate: Why Federalism Matters by Randy E. Brannett. Some people are fair-weather federalists who only assert the virtues of federalism when they lack the votes in Congress for national policies they prefer. I think this is a mistake. The federalism of our constitutional order has yielded some enormous advantages for protecting the rights retained by the people. Let's see why. Federalism leaves most legal issue to the states. If the federal government only has the power to provide for the common defense as well as to protect the free flow of commerce between states, along with a few other specific tasks, most of the laws affecting the liberties of the people will be made at the state level. This would include the regulation of most economic activity as well as what are today called social issues. In the 1824 case of Gibbons versus Ogden, Chief Justice John Marshall referred to this reserved state power as an immense mass of legislation which embraces everything within the territory of a state, not surrendered to the general government, all which can be most advantageously exercised by the states themselves. For example, inspection laws, quarantine laws, health laws of every description, as well as laws for regulating the internal commerce of the state, and those which respect turnpike rules, ferries, etc., are component parts of this mass. Marshall then affirmed that no direct general power over this object is granted to Congress, and consequently, they remain subject to state legislation. If the legislative powers of the Union carries them, it must be for national purposes. But he immediately made clear that by national purpose meant it must be where the power is expressly given for the special purpose, or is clearly incidental to some power which is expressly given. Federalism makes regulatory diversity possible. Given widespread disagreement about both economic and social policies, lodging this immense mass legislation in the states enables diversity of approaches to develop. Sometimes states are characterized as laboratories for experimentation, a paraphrase of a dissenting opinion by Justice Louis Brandeis in the 1932 case of New State Ice Corporation versus Lieberman. In his dissent, Brandeis described how the state may, if its citizens choose, serve as a laboratory and try novel social and economic experiments without risk to the rest of the country. When it comes to economic regulation, so long as they remain within the proper scope of the power to protect the rights, health, and the safety of the public, 50 states can experiment with different regimes of legal regulation, so the result can be witnessed and judged rather than endlessly speculated about. States will be somewhat inhibited in imposing restrictions on business by the threat of regulatory competition. Other states will be induced to offer more receptive business climate to entice business to relocate. Businesses small and large can decide to relocate if they deem a particular scheme of regulation to be too onerous. Critics this competitive dynamic disparages as a race to the bottom in which states are prevented from enacting beneficial regulations. Of course, it is possible that some states may enact inferior regulation to attract businesses seeking to lower the cost of production, but it is far more likely that local electorates will demand the sorts of reasonable regulations to which other states successfully implementing and a reasonable cost. Food voting empowers the sovereign individual citizen. When it comes to liberty, the competition provided by federalism empowers the sovereign individual, because one's vote in election is swamped by the ballots of millions of voters. It is simply irrational for most persons to invest too heavily in the time and resources to learn what it takes to vote wisely. Not only is it next to impossible to influence any particular policy by casting one's individual ballot, it is also impossible to separate that policy from others in the package offered by one of the two contending political parties. By contrast, Ya Soming explains, when voting with one's feet by moving to another city or state, one has a far greater control over the results. See La Soming, Democracy and Political Ignorance, 2013. Each person can individually control the state in which they live by selecting from among 50 choices, not just two. And they can witness the economic opportunities that result from different state policies. In the federal system, people are then free to move to another state for a better job or for a cleaner and safer environment, because their decisions will have tangible effects on their lives. It is far more rational for individuals to investigate the difference between states than it is the difference between political candidates. In short, what prevents a legislative race to the bottom in the federal system is the freedom of the sovereign individuals to race to the states with a better package of results. This dynamic is much less powerful at the national level, because individuals are much more reluctant to leave their country than their state. The importance of keeping social issues local. When it comes to social policy, the preferences of individuals loom even larger than with economic policies. Not only is it difficult to identify the objectively correct social policy, it is not clear that such policies even exist. Different people subjectively prefer to live in different types of communities, not only due to differing opinions about morality, but simply as a matter of taste. Given that, by their nature, communities must be one type or another, it is best to have as many different communities from which to choose as possible to satisfy the range of individual tastes, preferences, and moral commitments. A rich diversity of preferred lifestyles can only be achieved at the local level. As with economic policy, subnational competition between social policies in the federal system imposes a salutary constraint on the state governments by threatening an exodus of dissenting citizens to other states. On the positive side, with 50 states to choose from, it is far more likely that a person can find a state or municipality with a social environment in which they are more comfortable than if one social policy is imposed on the United States as a whole. The cost existing in one state for another is far lower than existing in the United States when one disagrees with a national policy. Consequently, on the federal system, the citizens' enhanced power of exist not only provides a comparatively greater constraint on legislative powers that is reserved to the states, it empowers individuals to achieve their own purposes far more effectively than relying on their ability to influence national policy by their vote or by leaving the country with their birth. In all these ways, liberty is more robustly protected by confining lawmaking to the state and local levels in the federal system, then moving all such decisions to the national level. Federalism avoids a political war of all against all. There is another and potentially even more powerful way that federalism protects the individual sovereignty of the people. When any issue is moved to the national level, it creates a set of winners and a set of losers, because the losers will have to either live under the winner's regime or leave the country. Everyone will fight much harder to achieve the result of feeling that to block the other side from achieving its goal. Consequently, the more issues that are elevated to the national level, the more contentiousness, bitterness, and gridlock develops as the people fight ever harder not to lose. The result is a political version of what Thomas Hobbes called a war of all against all. We can avoid this by ensuring that as many issues as possible are handled at the personal level of the individual person, which is why individual liberty is the ultimate means to the pursuit of happiness for people living in society with others, because the competitive process I have already described, reinforced by federal checks on state power, such individual liberties is far better protected at the local level than at the national. Again, it is not that the social and economic policy issues protected by a diversity of state regulations are less important than those handled at the national level. To the contrary, the more important the issue, the more likely it will engender a political war of all against all to avoid having another's social policy imposed on you. So the more important the issue, the less it is fit to be decided at the national level. For all these reasons, the United States has been a far more prosperous and contented country because of its federal system. And for the reading, I explained the individualist conception of we the people and popular sovereignty in Randy E. Burnett, our Republican Constitution securing the liberty and the sovereignty of we the people. And then we're going to move on another perspective that is beyond the sovereignty, beyond autonomy, a nation's beautiful federalism's future by Heather Jerkin. Federalism cases, as always, pose a dilemma for judges. The federal government is supposed to be a government of limited powers, but whenever the Supreme Court tried to cabin Congress reach the odds, and then the analysis in the dissent will be sounder than that in the majority opinion. If the judges don't act, on the other hand, they end up ignoring what most agree to be true. The federal government isn't supposed to be able to do anything it wants. As every law student learns, the facts on the ground have outpaced the founders' vision, as our interconnected system now leaves room for the federal government to regulate virtually everything the states can. That's why the Court's Commerce Clause decisions, in particular, are so easy to dismantle. It's a commonplace among lawyers that those decisions are trying to limit the limitless. Legal doctrine, in sharp contrast, it is limits. It has failed the court time and time again. So therein lies the tragic choice of federalism doctrine: do nothing or do something. Silly. In the efforts to limit the federal powers, the Rehnquist and Roberts courts have offered us two kinds of federalism decisions. Some start with the states. They mark where Congress power ends by identifying where state power begins, using sovereignty as a touchstone. It might seem odd for the court to begin with the states in describing the limits of federal power, but the court does so for a reason. It designates the outer limits of federal authority by marking the bounds of state power, much the way an artist designates a shape using negative space. Other federalism opinions, including most of the decisions of the Roberts Court, start with the Congress and delineate the bounds of its power in isolation rather than trace the state boundaries that federal power cannot cross. The court demarcates federal power without looking to the states. The court itself acknowledged this difference, see New York versus United States, 1992, and scholars often orient their teaching and writing around the difference between external sovereignty-based limits on congressional power and those derived internally. But it is conventional to note that the federalism cases come in these two flavors. The mistake scholars make is to treat both lines of doctrine as if they are equally flawed. They are not. The cases that rely on state sovereignty to limit federal power are misguided, but we should give the devil its due. These decisions have managed to generate doctrines that is more manageable, more comprehensible, and therefore more likely to endure. The cases that define federal power in isolation have been a failure on almost any measure. When the court addresses Congress power in isolation, it creates a challenge for itself how to bound the boundless. Pride is a handy stopping point that the sovereignty account provides. The court must decide how far to follow a chain of reasoning. In a world where the market touches virtually everything and the interconnected regulatory regimes can sweep almost anything into Article 1's ambit. Because these opinions attempted to identify limits through sheer force logic, the doctrine they generate amounts to little more than logic games, which can be played by both sides of any issue. This doctrine is unlikely to endure, and there will be little reason to mourn its passing. Federalism opinions that begin with the states have chosen the right starting point, but headed in the wrong direction because they have followed the trail marked by the sovereigntists. Agent Hart John Hart Ely, quipped about the one person, one vote doctrine. Manageability is sovereignty's long suit, but it's not clear what else it has going for it. The John Hart Ely, Democracy and Distrust, 121, 1980. The court is correct to define federal power in relational terms, but it's missed how that a relationship actually works. The states, the federal government, regularly shoulder to shoulder in the same tight policymaking space. So the thing about how the Affordable Care Act that has been implemented is just about anything written in environmental law these days. Take a look at telecom, the AFDC, Medicaid, drug enforcement, workplace safety, healthcare, immigration, even national security law. In these integrated regulatory regimes, the states and the federal government have forged vibrant, interactive relationships that involve both cooperation and conflict. If the court is going to generate a doctrine that is not only enduring but worth preserving, the case law must reflect these realities. So where should the court go from here? Returning to a sovereignty-centered federalism isn't the solution. While the court is much more likely to generate enduring legal doctrine if it begins with something manageable, The point is to build doctrine that is worth keeping around. And while the sovereignty count is admirably concrete and manageable, it is also wrong-headed and out of date. The court must have chosen the right starting point for its analysis, but it still got the wrong map. The court needs a relational account. It needs to think hard about how the states and the federal government interact. But it should think about those interactions differently. As intuitively appealing as the sovereignty argument is, it cannot possibly survive 21st century realities. It cannot survive in a world where sovereignty is not to be had, where regular overlap is a rule, where states' most important foreign power lies not in presiding over their own empires, but in administrating the federal empire. If the court is hunting for a new path, it should retain the central insight of the sovereignty cases, that the federal power must be defined in relation to the states, but take it in a different direction. The problem with the court's relational account of federal power is that it is not sufficiently relational. It fails to capture the deeply integrated, highly interactive relationship that exists between the states and the federal government in so many regular arenas. The states and the federal government forge vibrant working relationships that not engage in a governance equivalent of a parallel play. And there further reading, we're going to bypass that. And this is the end concerning Article 2, Section 8.